Picture this: Chicago, late January 1967. It was a school day, a work day, a normal winter morning in a city that believed it knew snow. The forecast mentioned it: a little accumulation, enough to be noticed, not enough to cancel plans. Children were already in classrooms. Office buildings were filling. Trains were running. No one knew that within hours the city would stop moving. By mid-morning, streets began to disappear. By noon, buses stalled where they stood. Trains filled with people who suddenly realized they might not be going home that night. This wasn't a storm that arrived in darkness. It arrived while millions were out in the world, at work, at school, on the move. Hour by hour, what was expected to be manageable became something else entirely. Cars were abandoned where they died. Offices turned into shelters. Schools became places to sleep. The city didn't panic. It froze. This was the blizzard of 1967, not because snow was unexpected, but because no one imagined how quickly an ordinary day could be buried. Please subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000. Thank you. Thursday, January 26th, 1967, 5:30 in the morning. Chicago was still dark, but already stirring. In a brick bungalow on the south side, a woman named Margaret set her coffee pot on the stove and turned on the kitchen radio. The weatherman mentioned snow. Of course he did. This was Chicago in January. Snow was part of life here. You bundled up. You drove a little slower. You got on with your day. Margaret's husband left for the steel mill at 6. Her 3 children ate oatmeal at the kitchen table, half asleep, dreading the cold walk to school. The oldest one, a boy of 12, complained about his boots being too tight. Margaret told him to stop fussing and put them on anyway. She had no way of knowing those boots would walk her son through something he would remember for the rest of his life. Across the city, in 1,000 homes just like Margaret's, the same morning ritual played out. Fathers heading to factories, mothers packing lunches, children trudging toward schoolhouses. The city was waking up the way it always did. Cold but functional, grey but moving. By 7 o'clock, the first flakes began to fall. At first, nobody paid much attention. Chicago had seen snow before, plenty of it. The city prided itself on being tough, on keeping the trains running and the streets clear, on never letting weather slow it down. The snow fell a little harder at 8, a little harder still at 9. And then something changed. By 10 o'clock, the snow wasn't just falling, it was attacking. Wind gusts of 50 miles per hour drove the flakes sideways, turning them into needles against exposed skin. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The sky, which had been a normal winter grey, turned white. Not white like clouds. White like nothing. Like the world had simply been erased. In downtown Chicago, office workers gathered at windows and watched the streets below disappear. At first, they joked about it. Looks like we're getting some weather. Then the jokes stopped. The buses had stopped too. Hundreds of Chicago Transit Authority buses sat motionless on Michigan Avenue, on State Street, on every major thoroughfare in the city. Their engines running, their passengers trapped inside. Some buses had been stuck for an hour, then 2 hours, then longer. The drivers couldn't move forward, couldn't move backward, couldn't do anything but wait while the snow piled up around them, over them, burying them where they stood. And that's when people started to realize this wasn't an ordinary storm. This was something else entirely. Let me tell you about the trains. Chicago's elevated train system, the famous L, was the city's backbone. It carried 500,000 people every day. Through rain and cold and whatever else the weather threw at it, the L kept running. That was the promise. That was what Chicagoans counted on. On January 26, 1967, the L broke that promise. By early afternoon, dozens of trains had frozen on their tracks. Not slowed, not delayed, frozen solid. The electric third rail that powered the system was buried under snow and ice. Switches that were supposed to move trains from one track to another wouldn't budge. Imagine being on one of those trains. You boarded at noon, expecting a 30-minute ride home. Now it's 3 o'clock. Then 5 o'clock. The train hasn't moved in hours. The heat is fading. Outside the windows, you can see nothing but white. You can hear the wind screaming against the car, rocking it back and forth. There are 60 other people in your car. Strangers mostly. Some are crying. Some are praying. Some are just staring straight ahead, trying to understand how a routine trip home became something out of a nightmare. One woman on a stalled train that day later recalled standing for 7 hours because there weren't enough seats. She was 3 months pregnant. By the time rescuers reached her train, she could barely feel her feet. Another passenger, a man in his 60s, had a heart attack in a stopped car near the Howard station. His fellow passengers tried to help him, but there was nothing they could do. They couldn't open the doors, couldn't reach anyone for help. They sat with him as he died, trapped in a frozen train that had nowhere to go. And these weren't isolated incidents. Across the city, the same scene played out again and again. Thousands of people trapped in trains they couldn't leave, waiting for rescue that might never come. But here's what nobody expected. The trains weren't the worst of it. Chicago's streets had become parking lots. Not with parked cars, with abandoned ones. When the storm hit its peak around midday, thousands of drivers found themselves stuck in traffic that simply stopped moving. Not slow traffic, not frustrating traffic. Traffic that was frozen in place as completely as if someone had poured concrete over every car in the city. At first, drivers did what drivers always do. They waited, honked their horns, inched forward when they could. But as the hours passed and the snow kept falling, something became clear. They weren't going anywhere. Not that day. Maybe not for days. So they started walking. Picture Lake Shore Drive, one of the most famous roads in America. 8 lanes of highway running along the shore of Lake Michigan, normally packed with cars doing 60 miles an hour. On the afternoon of January 26th, it was packed with something else. People, hundreds of them, then thousands, abandoning their cars where they sat and walking into the storm because staying put meant freezing to death. The wind off the lake was brutal, 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero with the wind chill. The snow was already knee-deep in places and getting deeper by the minute. And these weren't people dressed for a polar expedition. They were office workers in dress shoes, women in heels, businessmen in overcoats meant for the walk from taxi to lobby, not for survival. They walked anyway. Some made it to hotels. Some made it to office buildings that had stayed open. Some made it to the homes of strangers who saw them stumbling past and pulled them inside. Others didn't make it at all. A man named Edward was found the next morning, frozen to death 50 feet from a gas station that could have saved his life. He had gotten disoriented in the whiteout conditions and walked past it without seeing it. A woman named Dorothy collapsed in a snowdrift half a block from her apartment building. Neighbors found her the next day when they went outside to shovel. These weren't reckless people. They weren't foolish people. They were ordinary Chicagoans who had woken up that morning expecting nothing more than an ordinary Thursday. By nightfall, some of them were dead. The final count would reach around 60, but survival creates its own stories. And this storm created thousands of them. Back on the south side, that 12-year-old boy in the too tight boots was trapped at school. His name was Robert. When the storm hit, school administrators realized they couldn't send children home. The streets were impassable. The buses weren't running. Phone lines were jammed with parents trying to reach the school. So Robert and his classmates stayed put. All afternoon, all evening, through the night. The teachers did what they could. They rounded up blankets from the nurse's office, raided the cafeteria for whatever food was left, turned the gymnasium into a makeshift dormitory with wrestling mats spread across the floor. Robert slept next to his best friend Jimmy that night, both of them wrapped in the same wool blanket. Neither had ever spent a night away from home before. They lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, wondering if their parents were okay. In the morning, Robert's mother Margaret appeared at the school door. She had walked 2 miles through waist-deep snow to reach him. Her face was red from the cold. Tears were frozen on her cheeks. When Robert ran to her, she held him so tight he could barely breathe. He never complained about his boots again. Across the city, similar reunions were happening. Parents and children, husbands and wives. Families that had been separated by a storm finding each other again in the aftermath. But not everyone was so lucky, and not everyone was separated by accident. In the neighborhoods where Chicago's poorest residents lived, the blizzard wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a crisis on top of a crisis. The south side of Chicago in 1967 was a place of deep poverty. Families lived in crumbling tenements with unreliable heat. Pipes froze in normal winters. When the blizzard hit, those pipes didn't just freeze, they shattered. In one building on South Ellis Avenue, a woman named Thelma had 12 people depending on her. She was a widow. She had been raising children since she was 14 years old. She knew how to survive hard times, but she had never seen anything like this. The heat in her building failed the first night of the storm. The temperature inside dropped to 40 degrees, then 30. Her children huddled together under every blanket she owned while she boiled water on the stove just to create some warmth in the kitchen. They survived. Barely. But Thelma later said those 3 days were the longest of her life. And she wasn't alone. Across Chicago's poor neighborhoods, families were fighting the same battle. No heat, no food deliveries, no way to get to stores even if the stores had been open. No help coming because help couldn't get through the snow. The city that had seemed so modern, so capable, so prepared for anything, had been brought to its knees by snow. And the people who suffered most were the ones who had the least to begin with. But here's something remarkable about that storm. Even in the worst of it, even when the city was paralyzed and people were dying and nobody knew when it would end, Chicagoans found ways to help each other. Strangers opened their homes to strangers. Neighborhood bars became emergency shelters, serving free coffee to anyone who stumbled through the door. Churches distributed blankets and soup to whoever needed them, asking nothing in return. In one famous incident, a group of high school football players from the South Side spent 2 days digging out their neighbors' cars. They didn't ask for money. They didn't expect recognition. They just grabbed shovels and got to work. When asked later why they did it, one of them shrugged. "It needed doing," he said. "We were there." That's Chicago for you. The city that knew how to survive. The snow finally stopped falling on Friday, January 27th. By then, Chicago was buried under 23 inches of snow, the most the city had seen in a single storm since weather records began. But the storm stopping didn't mean the crisis was over. Far from it. The city now faced an impossible task. How do you dig out 3.5 million people? The answer, as it turned out, was slowly, painfully, block by block. Mayor Richard J. Daley, the legendary boss of Chicago politics, declared a snow emergency and mobilized every piece of equipment the city owned. Snowplows worked around the clock. Salt trucks spread so much salt that it would be months before the brown stains faded from city streets. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. There was simply too much snow and not enough machinery to move it. Some streets weren't plowed for a week. Some neighborhoods waited 10 days. In the meantime, life in Chicago ground on at a fraction of its normal pace. Businesses stayed closed. Schools remained shut. The Chicago Stock Exchange halted trading. The city that never stopped had been stopped cold. The economic damage was staggering. Factory production halted. Deliveries couldn't be made. Retailers lost the equivalent of millions in today's money. O'Hare Airport, then the busiest in the world, was closed for days. Runways vanished under snow. Thousands of passengers were stranded, sleeping in terminals, eating vending machine food, waiting for flights that kept getting cancelled. One traveler later recalled spending 3 nights at O'Hare, unable to leave, unable to fly, unable to do anything but wait. By the end, he said, the terminal smelled like a locker room, but nobody complained. What was there to complain about? We were all in the same boat. That phrase came up again and again in stories from the blizzard. All in the same boat, all in this together, all suffering, all surviving, all waiting for it to end. And when it ended, all rebuilding. But there were stories from those frozen days that went beyond mere survival. Stories that people would tell their children and grandchildren. Stories that became the way Chicagoans understood who they were. One of those stories was about a baby. On the evening of January 26th, as the blizzard raged at its worst, a woman named Patricia went into labor in her apartment on the north side. Her husband tried to call an ambulance. The lines were jammed. He tried to drive her to the hospital. Their car was buried. So he did the only thing he could do. He started walking. He carried his pregnant wife through snow that reached his thighs, step by step, block by block, with the wind screaming and the snow blinding and his wife crying out with every contraction. After what felt like hours, they reached a fire station. The firefighters took one look at Patricia and knew they didn't have time to wait for the storm to pass. They delivered the baby right there, in the fire station, while the blizzard howled outside. A healthy girl, 7 pounds, 6 ounces, born into a frozen world, surrounded by strangers who had become family in an instant. They named her Stormy. I don't know if that's true, but people told that story for years afterward. Maybe because it captured something about what Chicago went through, about how life finds a way, even in the worst moments, about how strangers become neighbors when there's no other choice. Another story that became legend involved the South Shore Line, one of the commuter rail lines that connected Chicago to its suburbs. When the storm hit, a train carrying hundreds of passengers got stuck between stations. The snow was too deep to move forward. The wind was too strong to send help. For 18 hours, those hundreds of people were trapped in that train. No food, limited heat, no idea when rescue would come. What happened next was remarkable. Instead of panicking, the passengers organized themselves. They rationed what little food was available, sharing candy bars and crackers among the children first. They moved together into the middle cars to conserve heat. They sang songs to keep spirits up. A retired nurse aboard the train moved from car to car, checking on passengers who seemed to be struggling, offering what comfort she could. A young man gave his overcoat to an elderly woman who was shivering. A group of strangers became something else, a community. When rescuers finally reached the train the next morning, they expected to find chaos. Instead, they found hundreds of tired, hungry, cold people who had taken care of each other through the night. Nobody died on that train. Nobody was even seriously hurt. Because when everything fell apart, ordinary people chose to hold it together. That's what the blizzard of 1967 taught Chicago about itself. The city was tough. Everyone knew that already. But tough in what way? The storm provided the answer. Not tough like a wall. Tough like a family. Battered but unbroken. Separated but always finding each other again. The cleanup took weeks. The economic losses ran into the hundreds of millions in today's dollars. The emotional scars lasted even longer. For years afterward, Chicagoans would measure every winter storm against the blizzard of 67. Is it going to be as bad as 67? That became the question every time the snow started falling. And the answer was always the same. Nothing was ever as bad as 67. Not the blizzard of 79. Not the storm of 99. Nothing. Because the 1967 blizzard wasn't just about snow. It was about a city being caught unprepared. About the false confidence that comes from thinking you've seen everything. About the shock of discovering you haven't. Remember, in 1967, weather forecasting was nothing like what we have today. No satellite imagery. No Doppler radar tracking storms in real time. No smartphone alerts warning you to stay home. People got their weather from the morning paper or the radio, and on January 26th, what the forecasters said was this: snow accumulating 4 to 8 inches, tapering off by evening. Instead, Chicago got 23 inches of snow driven by 50-mile-per-hour winds. The storm didn't taper off. It intensified, hour after hour, getting worse when the forecasts said it would get better. That disconnect between expectation and reality cost lives. People went to work because the forecast said they could. They sent their children to school because the forecast said it would be fine. They drove on highways because the forecast said accumulation would be moderate. By the time they realized the forecast was wrong, it was too late. The blizzard of '67 changed how Chicago thought about weather, about preparedness, about the gap between what we expect and what actually happens. After the storm, the city invested in better snow removal equipment, better communication systems, better protocols for when to close schools and offices. The lessons were expensive, paid for in frozen highways and stranded commuters, and around 60 lives lost. But they were learned. And there's another reason this storm mattered, a reason that goes beyond equipment and protocols and urban planning. The blizzard of '67 happened at a moment when Chicago was deeply divided. The city was struggling with questions of race and poverty that would explode into open conflict just a year later, when riots swept through neighborhoods in the wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. In January 1967, those tensions were simmering. The South Side and the North Side, Black Chicago and White Chicago, the haves and the have-nots, different worlds, separated by invisible walls that were more solid than any made of brick. But the blizzard didn't care about those walls. Snow fell on rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods alike. Lakeshore Drive mansions were just as buried as South Side tenements. The L trains froze whether they were carrying executives or janitors. For 3 days, Chicago was united in a way it rarely was. United by shared suffering, shared uncertainty, shared determination to get through. A black man helped a white family dig out their car. A white woman brought soup to her black neighbors. Kids from the projects played in the snow alongside kids from the suburbs, all of them reveling in school being cancelled, all of them building the same snowmen and having the same snowball fights. It didn't solve anything. The divisions would come roaring back once the snow melted. But for one frozen moment, Chicago remembered that a city isn't just buildings and streets. It's people, people who need each other, whether they want to admit it or not. And then there were the children. For adults, the blizzard was a crisis, a nightmare, a trauma they would carry for years. For children, at least some of them, it was something else. A 7-year-old girl from the suburbs later wrote about that storm in a memoir. She remembered her father coming home from work with snow caked on his eyebrows. She remembered walking to the corner store with her mother, pulling a sled because the car couldn't move. She remembered the next morning, waking up to discover the snow had drifted all the way to her bedroom window, and her first thought was that the world had turned into a fairy tale. She remembered building an igloo in the backyard with her brother, making snow angels until her snowsuit was soaked through, drinking hot cocoa while her mother made pancakes with bacon strips cooked right into the batter. For her, the blizzard wasn't a disaster. It was magic. And maybe that's the most human thing about storms like this one. The same event can be tragedy for one person and adventure for another, terror for an adult, wonder for a child, something to fear and something to remember fondly, sometimes in the same family, sometimes in the same heart. The people who lived through the blizzard of '67 are in their 70s and 80s now, if they're still with us. Some of them lost loved ones that week. Some of them nearly died themselves. Some of them just remember the cold and the fear and the endless waiting. But some of them remember something else. They remember neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming friends, a city pulling together when everything was falling apart. They remember the silence after the storm finally stopped, that strange, muffled quiet when the wind dies and the snow settles and the world holds its breath. They remember walking outside the next morning and seeing their city transformed. Familiar streets made unrecognizable, cars turned into white mounds, trees bent under impossible weight, everything they knew covered in white. And they remember thinking, we made it. We survived. Around 60 people didn't survive. We should never forget them. They went to work and school and errands on an ordinary Thursday and never came home. But hundreds of thousands of others did survive, because when the world turned white and cold and terrifying, they chose to be there for each other. That's the story of the blizzard of 1967. 58 years ago, Chicago froze solid. Trains stopped. Cars were buried. The city that believed it knew snow discovered it knew nothing at all. And in that frozen moment, in those impossible days, something was revealed. Not just about weather, not just about cities, but about people, about what we're capable of when everything else fails, about who we become when the world turns white. If you were there in January 1967, or if your parents or grandparents were, the memories are still vivid. The details may have faded, but the feeling hasn't. Those memories deserve to be kept. Share them. They remind us that winter can still surprise us, that forecasts can still be wrong, that the modern world is more fragile than we like to believe. They remind us that when everything falls apart, the only thing that saves us is each other. And they remind us that warmth doesn't come from heaters or furnaces or the sun breaking through the clouds. It comes from us, from the choices we make when there's no one watching and nothing to gain, from the simple, stubborn, beautiful human decision to help. The blizzard of 1967 is history now. The snow melted long ago, the streets were cleared, the city rebuilt itself and moved on, but the people who were there haven't moved on. They carry it with them still. And now, maybe, so do you. If you remember the blizzard, drop a comment and tell us your story. And please, subscribe to help us to reach 1,000. That's our main goal.